start first talking about the state of the war. So the red zones here are areas where the Russians don't necessarily control everything, but where the Russians absolutely have ejected Ukrainian forces. So think of them less as Russian-controlled territory and more as a no man's land that has a lot of Russian forces in them. All of the 200,000 troops that the Russians have deployed to the Russian-Ukrainian borders over the course of the last 3 months are now in Ukraine proper, and there are many, many more coming from Russia proper. And the rumor of the day is that Russia is about to enact martial law and activate its reserves. Writ large, Russian forces enjoy a 10-to-1 advantage over Ukrainian and regular military, but then again, the Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, and this is rapidly turning into a partisan conflict. There are a couple parts of the fronts I want to draw your attention to. First here, we've got a force coming north out of Crimea and one attempting to break through Kharkiv and go south. If they manage to link up roughly at Dnipro, they will have isolated the bulk of the Ukrainian army and certainly its best trained units, because they are currently deployed still in the east in Donetsk and Luhansk in order to keep what they thought was going to be the Russian main thrust. So at some point in the next few days, Zelensky's going to have to make a very hard choice about whether or not to withdraw those troops into a more defensible position. Otherwise, they're going to get isolated and cut up. Second, Mariupol somehow is still resisting, and the Russians are now pushing to the northwest and west out of the Crimea into Kherson. If Mariupol falls, which honestly I'm amazed that it hasn't yet, the Russians are going to be able to send large numbers of forces directly from Russia proper west to link up with the Crimea. They'll be able to push west from there to Odessa, which is the world's largest wheat loading facility, and they'll link up with pre-existing forces in Moldova that are in Transnistria. At that point, I fully expect the Russians not just to curve to the northwest to try to get to Lviv, but to actually remove Moldova from the map. Moldova only has about excuse me, less than 3 million people. Their military is a joke. Their political system is isolated and fractured. If you had asked me 8 days ago in any war scenario if Moldova was going to fall, I would have said, of course, and it will fall quickly. But we've seen the Ukrainians put up a lot bigger fight, so maybe the Moldovans will surprise us as well. But make no mistake, the Russians are going to win this war. What we've got here is a map from Accidental Superpower. That's our second book. And the highlights, the dotted lines indicate where the Russians are aiming for. From the Russian view, if they can forward position in these places, they will plug the gateways into the Russian heartlands, and they can defend those plugs with fewer forces than defending the wide open frontier they have right now. That's what this is about. That is what this has always been about. And because the Russians see this as a national survival issue, they will not back down. There's going to be a very, very nasty occupation, but Russia is not afraid to level everything. And as we have seen in Grozny and Aleppo, when the Russians get frustrated, they just start firing artillery in mass for weeks on end until there's nothing left that can resist. If you want to entertain that I might be wrong and that the Russians can be talked out of this or that they might back down, if they do that, no one's going to lift the sanctions anytime soon. So they would have paid all of the price for a successful war without getting any of the benefits from the more secured borders. We would be looking at a complete demographic and geopolitical collapse of the Russian Federation in short order, probably within a decade. I don't see that happening. Okay, on to energy. What matters on this are the green and the red lines and circles. We left the dotted line on there so you can see where the Russians are aiming for. Now there's half a dozen things going on. We're going to spend a lot of time on this graphic. First things first, the Turks have activated the Treaty of Montreux, which was a treaty that was forced on the Turks after World War I, I believe in 1936 specifically. And one of the clauses that the Turks actually like is that it allows them to close the straits to belligerents in case of war. The Turks have activated Montreux. The Russians are belligerent, and so it's very difficult to see any sort of Russian naval activity going in and out. It also allows the Turks on a case-by-case basis to stop tankers. And so we're already seeing a unwillingness on the part of shipping companies the world over to even sail into the Black Sea in the first place to pick up Russian crude. That the biggest problem here are the black arrows on the Black Sea, Novorossiysk, and on the North Sea near St. Petersburg. Now, these two facilities are the Russians' largest oil exporting locations. Each one handles about, well, each one has nameplate capacity for about 1.5 million barrels per day. They don't always go to full capacity. But because the Russians have hit some vessels, civilian vessels, in the Black Sea, most shippers have activated their insurance clauses, which nullifies any shipping insurance that might have held by tankers. So they're not even going into the area to do pickups. We've seen roughly 3.5 million barrels per day, so it's mostly these locations, but a little elsewhere, where customers have chosen to either cancel contracts or even if they've gotten a cargo, to then deny it and say, you just need to go somewhere else. So we're seeing a complete collapse in the Russian position for exporting crude west, even though crude is not covered in the sanctions at all. The insurers aren't doing it, the ship owners aren't doing it, the ship crews aren't doing it, the dock workers aren't unloading it, and the Turks are making it difficult to get in and out of the Turkish straits. Next up, the purple. This is Tengiz. Now, the Tengiz-Chevrolet project dates back to actually Gorbachev. It was started when the Soviet Union was still around. It was supposed to be the first foreign direct investment project of size into Russia under Glasnost and Perestroika. Of course, the Soviet Union fell, and since then, Chevron and Exxon have continued working in that space. Because it is in Kazakhstan, it has not been affected directly by any sort of sanctions or boycotts. But the pipeline that brings Tengiz crude to market goes through Russia and loads up at Novorossiysk. So the folks at Tengiz are realizing very quickly that whether or not they deserve to or not,